people, blacks and Indians.
In fact, Africans were so fierce in fighting that it changed the politics of America. When Toussaint L'Ouverture won the war in Haiti and defeated Napoleon, a shudder went through the entire world, not only for African people, but other people. Asian people saw that, and they said, wait a minute, you know, it's possible to overthrow the yoke of domination. When Nat Turner and when other slave revolts occurred, when maroon slaves, when the slaves got free and ran away and established nations in places like Cuba, Oriente Province in Cuba, when they were in Mexico, and San Lorenzo de las Cobra, I believe it was called, in Mexico, nations of Africans in those areas who had gotten away and established themselves as resistance movements. When those movements in Florida, you know, when the Maroons and the Indians got together, the Seminoles and the Maroons, which were the Creek Indians, and the Africans got together and established a nation in Florida, then these role models of freedom and role models of resistance were so powerful that it forced a change in the politics of America.
The Maroons of Jamaica were unique because a lot of history surrounding their success always includes the mention of one central figure, a woman named Nanny. Nanny and a group of maroon African men with names like Cujo literally drove the British and French crazy with their ability to fight and elude capture. Very little accurate information comes to us about Nanny herself. Some writers speculate that her name may have been a European jumbled distortion of the Ashanti word, ni. If so, Nanny came from a long line of female warriors, and also warrior queens. Europeans found it impossible to defeat the Ashanti in Africa until the African Fanti joined the fight. Queen Mother Yeha Asantewaa challenged the men of her people that if they wouldn't fight, the women would. Let's introduce you to someone writer David Sweetman wrote about in 1971. His article called her the woman who saved her people. She's known as Angolan Queen Nzinga. She fought the Portuguese to end colonial domination in her country. African people also resisted in more calculated, so-called passive ways. If you travel up and down the coast around Georgia and Florida, you'll notice a lot of tabby constructions. Africans insisted on building their houses their way, even as slaves. Writer David Peniston in the West Journal of Black Studies, Volume 12, 1978, describes some of these contributions in the Black Architectural article that he wrote. But blacks also resisted slavery by passively not doing the work, or doing it poorly on purpose. They knew they should have been paid, and they resented the beatings, poor housing and clothing, and then behaved accordingly.
They shuffled us like pinochle cards. The intention was that if people cannot speak the same language, it is more difficult for them to devise some kind of escape or insurrection plan. Our last line of resistance was the music that was in our souls. We were in a strange land. We had been snatched from our homeland, raped of our culture, cut off from all that was familiar to us. But down there in the canebrake in the brush arbor, we continued to sing and moan and chant for freedom on the rhythm forms and musical idioms that were familiar to us from Mother Africa. I shall not be moved. I shall not. I shall not. Once we were introduced to this new language, we developed what has been called the pidgin English of the slaves. And on those rhythm forms and musical idioms, after being introduced to this Jesus person, we developed that baseline music art form called the African American spiritual.
In fact, resistance and rebellion are something that occur everywhere that you see African slaves. Australian Aborigines refused to remain slaves to European invaders. The successful revolts proved the theory that you can't effectively enslave people on their own land. But in some cases, inhumane treatment of slaves, even in death, may have demoralized these Africans, as Charlie Mitchell of Darien, Georgia, explains.
On Black Bed Island, they had a crematory over there, and when they come on the ship down there, they put it in the crematory and burn it and save the dust.
How did they do that? I mean, was it an elaborate process?
Yes, it was a live process. It's just like a oven, like you put the wood under the bottom and the body on the top, and it fall on the side.
How did you find out about this? Who told you that?
I was working on Black Bed, foreman for some mans, and the supervisor, we was walking, and we went over to, and he wanted to show me this place.
The first slave revolt took place around 1500, less than 20 years after the formal beginning of chattel slavery. These dates let you know it was the first of many. Most significant in the Americas is the Suriname South American independent communities of Colombo in Brazil. In 1595, this community of escaped slaves established itself. By 1720, more than 20,000 African black descendants lived in a single community of Palmares. Information provided by Afrocentric historian Larry Obadele Williams shows, in between that time, white plantation owners sent armies to fight these African independents. The Europeans lost all of their battles and finally had to sign treaties. When those were broken, however, white South American masters had to liberate some of their black slaves to fight the Suriname independence. That just didn't work. As soon as they were liberated, the slaves joined forces with the enemy, their brothers. The rebellions finally ended with the European defeat in 1831, which happens to be the same year of Nat Turner's rebellion in America. In Haiti, slaves revolted for decades before the final triumph of Toussaint L'Ouverture in the 1800s. Astute slaveholders around the world knew the era was ending. But the majority of these slaveholders wanted to believe that slavery was a natural condition for blacks. They wanted to believe blacks happily worked for free. They wanted to believe the Negroes were happy with the lifestyle that made white masters rich.
Slaves are very valuable. You want them to grow that cotton to make that money. So what does that do? Well, the slave doesn't have free choice, but you need cooperation. So there would be a mixture of force and inducement. You wouldn't be too abusive because you might kill the slave. On the other hand, they're not a free person, so you can get away with things that a person who could quit would never put up with. So you get this kind of odd balancing here. It's not an equal balancing, but still the slaveholder or the overseer, whoever's doing it, needs that cooperation. On the other hand, they always got the whip in the background.
Laws and legislation from the era indicate that the American response to successful slave revolts was to stop the importation of Caribbean slaves, at least to North America. But that didn't stop the insurrections from taking place here. Not only did we have the uprisings of Nat Turner or Denmark Vesey, but revolts on slave ships such as the Armistead in the 1700s, the one in Gloucester, Virginia in 1663, which, by the way, was the first revolt in colonial America, or the revolt in 1712, which took place in New York City, or the Gabriel Prosser revolt in Richmond, Virginia in 1800. All of these pointed to the fact that slaves were not happy with their condition and wanted things to change. Of course they did, but only after a war. Even then, African people were not given credit for fighting for their own freedom, as the all-black Massachusetts 54th Regiment did during the war between the states. African resistance to domination has taken on other forms, some of them economic. The Marcus Garvey movement also receives little mention in history, even though he established publishing corporations, organized Pan-African engineering groups, and literally led the way in the 1920s as a black entrepreneur. Strong opposition from the United States government and private business ended his plans for national sovereignty. But in Atlanta, financial resistance to racial oppression had more success. On the southwest side of town in the Collier Heights area, there still stands a community of upper-middle-class homes built by black contractors, financed by black banks, and lived in by black people. It's another example of resistance of African people against oppression. Now, perhaps